All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the CoreNet Mid-Atlantic chapter for this morning's event, Workplace 2021 Plus, Adapting the Age Facility. My name is Brian Alvarez. I'm the co-chair of the Special Events Committee and the Director of Business Development with MOI. With changes to the business, to the way business operate and teams collaborate, work, and integrate technology, design trends have also shifted. Today's conversation will discuss the impacts of densified workplaces on the building with aging infrastructures and what can be done to design safe, comfortable, and healthy workplaces. Thank you to all of our chapter sponsors for your continued support and dedication throughout this year. Please note, our speakers are happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom page, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. It's now my pleasure to provide a short introduction to each of our speakers. So first, Greg Brenner. Greg Brenner is the Managing Director of National Client Services at WB Engineers and Consultants. After graduating from the University of Maryland with a degree in planning, Greg spent the first 17 years of his career practicing architecture. Since joining WB Engineers and Consultants in 2008, he has led a team of engineers in developing client relationships, facilitating business development efforts, and promoting the technical expert as an integral part of the BD process. Next, we have Ray Doyle, and Ray is the managing principal of WB Engineers and Consultants in Washington, DC. As a dynamic engineer with 25 years in the industry, Ray excels at leading innovative design strategies with a focus on energy consumption conservation. He specializes in facility design management within the life science and pharmaceutical industry and was a recipient of the ASHRAE Technology Award. Ray is an accomplished speaker and is presented as a subject matter expert at national conferences for ISPE, NFMT, AIA, and more. Last but not least, we have Casey Parker, and Casey is the technology director of Gensler, Baltimore. His past experience includes a vast array of project types, including corporate workplace, government, and defense, hospitality, and retail. Casey's personal approach to projects is defined by the development of a strong team dynamic. By incorporating the owner, design team, and contractors in the project delivery process, an inclusive environment is defined, built on an open communication and efficiency in delivery. As we look back on the pre-pandemic densified workplace and its impact on aged facilities, what can we expect moving forward? What are the impacts of aged facilities and readapting the workplace to meet the upcoming challenges of returning to work and beyond? Greg, Ray, and Casey are going to give us a deeper understanding of what we can do as corporate real estate professionals and making sure our lease terms, facility infrastructure, and building interiors support healthy building operations. But first, we're gonna start with a little quiz to test our general overall understanding. So you should have just received a little quiz that popped up, and I'll read these through. And please just take a couple seconds to run through these. So number one, what percentage of all buildings in the US were constructed before the year 2000? 40%, 60%, or 80%? Number two, what is the average square foot per person designed for workplace over the past 5 years? 80 to 125, 125 to 175 square feet, 175 to 225. Number three, what is the impact of increased ventilation on workplace? Reduction of viruses, cleaner air, greater cognitive ability. Number four, in buildings constructed prior to the year 2000, what building system should be considered for replacement? VAV boxes, air handlers, cooling towers, or all the above? Number five, which of the following is not a viable air cleaning technology? UVGI, PCO, ionization, and humidification. Number six, in an office space, if an office space is part of a multi-tenant floor, I'm stuck with my landlord ability or inability to invest in indoor air quality improvements. And obviously this is a true or false statement. Lastly, number seven, what is the average return on investment for improving indoor air quality? Less than 2 years, 2 to 4 years, and then greater than 4 years. So we'll give another 10 seconds To finish up those, and I will pass it on. So without further ado, welcome to everybody. Please enjoy this presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please shoot it down below in the questions, and we'll work our best at the end to answer them. So passing it on to Greg.
Brian, thank you for having us this morning. We're excited to be here. We will share the responses to the questions along the way in our presentation. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks again. We're excited to be here today and spending time with CoreNet. It's a little bittersweet because we were supposed to give this presentation in April of this year. And in April of this year, we all went home and worked from home and have been dealing with this pandemic for over 5 months now. And we've learned a lot along the way. And we're going to work today to integrate what we had as a previous presentation with the necessary improvements and the opportunities for technology advancement in healthy buildings and helping support the challenges around this pandemic. So a little bit about WB. So we are a mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineering firm, national, 12 offices coast to coast, 150 engineers. Ray and I operate out of the DC office where we have 30 engineers and serve the Mid-Atlantic. Also, earlier this year, we opened our Baltimore office, which we're excited about.
As Brian mentioned before, I work for Gensler, which many of you are already familiar with. I work on our Gensler's Baltimore, Maryland office. It's co-managed by Vaki Mawema and Dan Jones. Our office focuses on a wide variety of practice areas, including workplace design, corporate office buildings, government and defense, along with many other areas of expertise.
So we're going to get right into it. And today we're going to cover a couple things in regards to overall aged infrastructure, electrical capacity, HVAC comfort and control, ventilation and indoor air quality technologies, and then wrap up with lease terms and return on investment.
So most people don't realize that 80% of commercial building space was constructed before the year 2000. That means that most corporate real estate portfolios are comprised of facilities that have either gone through a repositioning or are in need of one. So if we go back to our original question, what percentage of the buildings in the US were constructed before 2000? And the answer is
80%.
C. So in terms of workplace density, during the 80s and 90s, most buildings were designed to accommodate approximately 200 square feet per person. Base building designs were focused around less dense workplace, which is why many of the modern interior designs of the past 10 years have required modification to egress components like stairs and exit doors, toilet facilities, and HVAC upgrades. And as we've moved into the last 10 years, sort of pre-pandemic workplace, the interior designs have pushed the envelope on greater density. They've averaged closer to around 100 square feet per person. And now that we're faced with this sort of post-pandemic workplace, I think the question we're hearing from a lot of clients is, what is the impact of potentially reverting back to a less densely occupied workplace? So if we go back to our question, what is the average square footage per person designed for workplace over the past 5 years? The answer would be A, somewhere between 80 and 125 square feet.
So Casey, we've been talking a lot about the need for social distancing in buildings and how this densified space changes that. But the great part is the architectural partners in the marketplace, much like Gensler, are solving those problems in office space and giving people solutions that work for their business. But the question is, what about the other aspects of the building? What's behind the walls and above the ceilings? If you have a building that's more than, that's older than 20 years old, you're dealing with a lot of infrastructure issues. So in the post-pandemic world, how are we dealing with that? Those are some of the challenges we're going to face. The other 20% is another large portion of what we're dealing with. And the reason we're dealing with that in a lot of ways, that the latest or the newest buildings in the marketplace have been designed so tightly that they find themselves with less flexibility for adapting to the changes with the post-COVID and the COVID pandemic.
And so we're kind of faced with this dichotomy. We've got older buildings that may have infrastructure that's a little bit more robust, but failing. And then we've got new buildings that have the other components of the interiors, like this particular facility that has the larger stairs, the more amenities, and maybe lacking the infrastructure needed to push through some of the responses to the pandemic that we're going to talk about here shortly, and also in regards to healthy buildings moving forward.
So in terms of electrical capacity, I'm always reaching back to engineering partners to verify the overall electrical capacity for clients. Comes up a lot. So especially when we're considering older facilities, with the increasing IT and AV and personal computer monitor needs, we're being questioned on whether 7 to 8 watts per square foot is possible. And the reality is that most older buildings were designed with a much higher wattage per square foot requirement. Through Energy Star, LED lighting, HVAC technologies, we're actually operating buildings at a much lower energy consumption than in the past. So in most cases, the electrical capacity is not the issue. We can accommodate 6 watts per square foot. The issue is more the overall distribution may be lacking. So upgrading to a larger number of circuits may be needed.
Yeah, and so the key to figuring that very early on, as you consider build outs going forward, Casey, is something important as you start to figure in budget and the cost of that potential increased distribution.
So the HVAC comfort scenario, we talked about how the impact of comfort is related to the increased density and how comfort can create a healthier building. So I got a little story for you here that we worked on a project in the DC area. It was support a total gut renovation of a 10-story owner-occupied building in Baltimore, Maryland. And the owner was going down this idea of just replacement in kind, which is usually the kind of baseline. People say, well, just place what's in kind, without really evaluating it. And it turns out, as we started to evaluate it, the architect on the project was replacing the skin and upgrading interior finishes and the interior renovation and improving efficiencies with equipment and lights. So we got into a deeper dive on replacement of equipment, and we were able to save the owner and the project an additional 15% in total, cooling because of the skin, and that reduced in a reduction in total cost of the infrastructure, allowing them to double the occupancy for almost, in this case, less cost and a smaller system. So it was a win-win for everybody, but it does take a comprehensive approach to these solutions.
And Ray, with the upgrade and efficiency of those systems, here we're then now faced with this dichotomy on, is that system right-sized for the capacity and needs moving forward in a post-pandemic era?
That's a great question, and I'll touch on it real quick before I jump into filtration. Is the idea that because the densified space had higher capacities, if you start to reduce that as we de-densify a little bit with the reduction in occupancy, what that exactly will be is a little fuzzy in everybody's crystal ball. But we know it's going to reduce some. It may not go back to the same density that the industry was pushing, but because of that, you'll have some available capacity in fans and in cooling and heating to support increased ventilation and higher filtration. So looking at the filtration process, what's really happening here, this is post-COVID and then beyond COVID, right? We need to increase the filtration. We've realized that because of COVID, we've realized that filtration standards within the industry were based on really the equipment manufacturer's goal to protect the equipment. It really didn't have anything to do with indoor quality when it was originally set up. And as it's evolved, and now we've created a lot of these metrics for how much people can be impacted by dust and particles that float through the air, there's a lot more focus on filters. So, if we look at the average office building that has a MERV 13 filter or a minimum efficiency rating value of 8, it's only going to capture about 11% of the particles. It's very simple to go from a MERV 8 to a MERV 13. Most air handling units can handle that without any problem. There might be a small reduction in airflow, but at the end of the day, you're going to get a 4x reduction in the amount of particles that are recirculated. And the virus rides on other particles. It just doesn't float in the air by itself. So that's a great improvement without any dramatic cost being spent. And that increase in filtration, when you look at it in a total cost per floor, we use the reference of about a 20,000 square foot floor plate for a baseline. A typical office space in most buildings around 20,000. So, you're only looking at $1,000 per floor per year. So that's a minimal increase from what it might have been at around $100 per square foot or $100 per floor.
Yeah, and Ray, as we continue to reference these dollars, we're going to summarize everything at the tail end of this and a return on investment. So keep that in mind. I know that we get a lot of questions on the daily from clients and building operators in regards to the cost associated with some of the recommendations from ASHRAE and CDC in response to COVID-19. But I want to make sure that everybody is crystal clear on one thing. As we have done a significant amount of research over the past 5 months, we're talking about beyond COVID-19. We've realized that COVID-19 is the impetus that has caused us to react the way we are. But in reality, what we're outlining here and through the rest of this presentation are things that will help your facilities be a more healthier workplace and net better results from your employee base moving forward. And so as we talk about ventilation, most of us in the industry of engineering and in facilities feel like, well, if we're aligned with ASHRAE, we're in a great spot. And the reality is, ASHRAE is a minimum, right? We're talking about the bare minimums with ASHRAE and code compliance. And the ability to go beyond that is not as great as you might think. And so when we think about the potential, if I said that, again, taking this 20,000 square foot floor plate example, which in a 200 square foot per person is about 100 people. And I told you that you could add to your corporate bottom line revenue 650,000 people just by increasing and maximizing your ventilation. My guess is that most of those in the C-suite and the CFO would say, do it. Do what you got to do. We'll take that money to the bank. And so the reality is that you can do that. And so Ray, why don't you take us quickly through the impacts of increasing fresh air and touch upon the COG effect study.
No, I think, thank you, Greg. That's a good one. And the interesting thing is that there's a lot of people that used to promote this, LEED used to promote it, but without a lot of strong documentation to support why increased ventilation was better. So what happened a few years back, Syracuse Center for Excellence and Harvard Institute Review Board, along with State University in New York, went and did a cognitive effects study. And they went through and they took, in the case of this study, they used architects, a group of architects, and they evaluated how increased ventilation or decreased ventilation would affect their ability to problem solve and to create solutions to puzzles, but in the case of architecture, of course, solutions to design buildings and spaces. And that was very dramatic. The improvement was doubling and tripling their effect of cognitive ability. And this chart specifically kind of outlines not that test results. This was from a different test from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, but it supports the same Harvard review. The interesting thing about the Harvard review was that, basically doubling the outside air from 10 to 20% gave those people the ability to increase their problem solving capabilities. And then they calculated what that was worth to businesses in their productivity. And it was, as Greg said a minute ago, an exponential improvement. If you could double the outside air, and that's, at $40 per person per year, you could get advantages in productivity close to around $6,500 per person, which is very dramatic. The thing I'd like to point out on this presentation slide is kind of interesting, but if you follow the matrix as it goes along, if you're presenting and you're up here moving around and you're talking, we could occupy a space and function really well with a low CO2. But what happens when you're at a sedentary problem solving, working at a computer, reading or writing type of function, your ability to be productive drops off very quickly at higher CO2 levels. And that's really what drives this increased ventilation and doing better than the code, as Greg said. We don't want to do the minimum. We need to look beyond the minimum. We need to find ways to make spaces better and healthier and safer.
And so, Ray, all this time, I thought that when I worked late at the office and I was so unproductive and lost focus and nearly fell asleep, I thought it was because I was tired, because I had gotten into the office at 5 a.m. But the reality is it's because the outside air was shut off, building system shut down at 6 p.m. And this is why we're going to talk about this again when we speak to lease terms. But going forward, this needs to be on the forefront as we negotiate leases. I want to go back just a minute, Ray, and let you speak to this slide real quickly in regards to increasing that ventilation and fresh air.
Yeah, no, I think it's real important that we understand that just increasing the ventilation by 30% better than the code is a well certification standard. So, you got LEED, which was pushing it before, but now you have Fitwel and WELL standards that drive that. But we need to make sure we look at buildings over 10 years old could already be ready to accomplish this goal. The thing we talk about in older buildings is that the systems were designed for much higher lighting levels. So they would have been 2-3 watts a square foot for lighting. And for the people that follow the reduction in lighting watts per square foot, you can get it down to a half a watt a square foot. So there's a lot of energy available, capacity available in the HVAC and electrical systems in those older buildings. So it's a lot easier for them almost right out of the gate to just adjust their dampers to move the percentage from 10 to 20% and increase that ability for them to help their employees be more productive and not have to replace a lot of infrastructure, assuming that it's still functioning and when it's 20 years old, you got to worry about replacement. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Right. And when we talk about the cost associated with that in a 20,000 square foot floor plate, again, 100 people, it's roughly $40 a person per year to increase that or to overcome that additional energy in pushing that outside air.
Yeah. So 4,000 per floor is a small amount of money for, as you said, for corporate America to look at when you talk about the great advantages you can get from it.
And if you weigh 4,000 against 650,000, I know which pot I'd rather take. So the question and answer, right? What is the impact of increased ventilation on workplace? The answer is C, greater cognitive ability.
So aged infrastructure, aging facilities. What we talked about a few minutes ago was just about how 80% of the buildings are more than 20 years old. This is just something that is somewhat obvious to a lot of engineers in the community, but a lot of people in real estate tend to lose sight of it. You got a 20-year-old building, you're looking at needing to replace or budget replacement for all of these types of equipment. So it's essentially the entire mechanical infrastructure. From water, water cooled air conditioners, heat pumps, fan cool units, VAV boxes, cooling towers. There's other things like chillers that fall in this category. So you really need to make sure you understand, and budget for the cost of replacement. The key is, as we talked about in the earlier story, making sure that you study the replacement. It's not a replacement, it's in kind. It's a replacement that can support the current model for densified workplace or de-densified workplace as that evolves, but also the indoor air quality and healthy buildings initiatives. We need to make sure we have the ability to bring in outside air, the ability to filter the air more. And the ability to maybe have that modulate from season to season, from flu season to non-flu season. So looking at those facilities and making sure you study those replacements is very important.
Right, and as you look at taking down new leases, and we heard the other week in the big debate that corporate real estate is continuing to look at the leased facility need for continued use. And last thing you want to do when you move into a new building is have to live through an elevator rehabilitation, have to live through a VAV box upgrade. It is painful on your employees and something that can be identified very early on and negotiated into your lease so that those things can get done ahead of taking occupancy. And so the next question was, in buildings constructed prior to 2000, what building systems should be considered for replacement? And the answer is all of the above. And the reality is, most of the time, some of this has been addressed, but not all of it. So making sure that as you bring your design professional team on early to help kick the tires on those facilities, you've identified all the potential so that you're aligned with cost and budget. But the other thing we need to consider as we move into facilities or as we look at modifying our existing facilities to support returning to the workplace is active mitigation technologies. And as we've been speaking across the country and talking with clients about the need for return to the workplace and what options there are, and the work that we're doing, we've really come down to 3 tried and true viable technologies: UVGI and electronic air cleaners, including photocatalytic oxidation and ionization systems. And so the facilities that these systems are installed in vary based on the topology of the mechanical system. But let's give a quick overview of all 3 of these technologies if we can, Ray.
That's great. So the UVGI is ultraviolet C light. I always like to tell people that if you look at the spectrum of UV light, you know, UVA and UVB light is the light that gives you a suntan, gives Greg a suntan, gives me a wicked sunburn. But UVC light is the light that is filtered outside by the ozone layer. So if you're in a condition where you're you know, in exposed to UVC light, it's very bad for your skin, it's bad for your eyes. And that's what actually kills the virus. That radiation, due to exposure time and distance of the radiation, gives you the kill rate on viruses. So UVC lights are an effective way to do it. We don't recommend them in occupied spaces, obviously. For those reasons, we don't want to give people skin cancer. PCOs, you know, the photo catalytic sorry, Greg.
Catalytic oxidation.
Catalytic oxidation is a newer technology, but it's actually really interesting technology because it has the ability, using a UVC light, to create hydroxyls. Hydroxyls are unstable OH ions, positive and negative ions, and they are unstable and they want to break apart carbon chains, and they break apart things like viruses, VOCs, fossil fuels, smoke, to purify the air, to clean the air. So that's a really, really nice technology. The thing that's really nice about that technology is those ions only live for about a half a second, and they do their job inside the air handling unit. The next technology is ionization, which is something that is relatively new. It has had some bad history with ozone production, but a lot of the manufacturers have eliminated that, almost reduced it to a point where it's not measurable. But they do something that's a little different. They create ions and they flood the space with ions, the positive and negative O ions and hydrogen ions, so oxygen and hydrogen. And those ions attack carbon molecules, they attack viruses and things on surfaces in the air. The real challenge that we have as an industry is determining how much that impacts us as carbon beings. Humans are carbon beings, and those ions in the space at some level will have a detrimental impact to our health. How it's measured and how much of an impact it'll be long term is not really well known yet. So for those reasons, WB is not recommending that you use those types of systems in occupied spaces. We love the idea of providing similar systems in unoccupied mode to cleanse and clean the space. It's a natural, ions are naturally formed in the atmosphere, and they do clean the space. So in unoccupied mode, that's a nice way to address things like COVID-19 and other viruses in the air.
Yeah, and so, when we talk about cost, again, UVGI and that single air handler on 20,000 square foot floor, about $20,000. PCO a bit more at 40,000, and then ionization certainly varies depending on how you're going to use it. And all of these technologies are in the range of 90 to 95% effective on viruses like COVID-19, recognizing we don't have it to test, but on SARS and other similar viruses, they have been 90 to 95% effective. So when we look at the question, which of the following is not a viable air cleaning technology? The answer is humidification. That was a trick question because humidification does have an impact on viral transmission, but it is not an air cleaning technology. And if anybody needs or would like more information on these technologies, we have another presentation that we're happy to give to you and your company. But let's get into lease terms, because lease terms are really going to help drive change as we continue to work past COVID-19 and moving forward in healthy buildings. And the reality is we see the opportunity for win-win scenarios in lease terms going forward. We've already demonstrated the net impact on increased ventilation to an employee workforce. And we've identified the minimal cost that it takes a building to operate under the new recommendations from ASHRAE in regards to additional filtration and ventilation. But the key is getting that in to your lease very early on. When we talk about a lot of repositioned buildings, in the past, most of those dollars for repositioning have been spent on Casey's beautiful work in architecture. And not to make too light of that with this lipstick and pig reference, but the reality is if you don't address what's above the ceiling and behind the walls, you could be into some real issues down the line. And so, we have supported, and I'd like to tell just a quick story of, $1.2 million in savings, where we were supporting a client who was doing a headquarters consolidation, and the building was going through a beautiful repositioning effort, one of the reasons they were attracted to it. And the base building systems were in great shape. They were older, but they were extremely well maintained. And there was no reason to think that there was going to be any issues until we started getting above the ceilings and looking at the VAV boxes and determined that all the VAV boxes needed to be replaced. They were doing a controls upgrade, so it was the perfect opportunity to do that. And because the lease wasn't done yet, we were able to engage, negotiate with the broker, the landlord. The landlord was able to get their investors to contribute another $1.2 million in tenant improvement allowance. And if we hadn't done that at the beginning of the project, Casey would have been all over us because we would have taken out some beautiful aspect of the architectural elements that $1.2 million in funding would have needed to go to. So no different than negotiating very early on with your landlord on other improvements to the building infrastructure. We heard in the big debate that corporate real estate is willing to pay for healthier buildings. They're willing to pay for buildings that have spent the time to improve their infrastructure and airside because they know that we'll get benefits of that moving forward.
So Greg, real quick, a little anecdotal story there, because we really are pressing this idea of healthier buildings. And the idea that if you can replace all the VAV boxes in your building and control your temperature closer to the set point that allows you to be comfortable in the environment you're in. I always challenge people to think about when they're in their office space, when they look at the thermostat and it's 68 degrees or it's 75 degrees. And some people will say, well, that lease range, that's within the lease range. The building engineer should be, able to say, well, you're in the lease range. And we need to, as a community, as a real estate organization and industry, say that's not acceptable anymore. Think about how much energy and time is spent by your brain thinking about the cold or the heat. You could be focused on your job and the activity at hand, making yourself that much more productive, healthier, and happier. We should not be so stressed about things so simple as temperature. So replacing those VAV boxes was really important to me in that project. It seemed relative, and it saved them money because they got it in the lease.
Mhm.
But some of the long-term effects are what's so important about that solution we created for that project.
Agreed. And so when we think about, this statement in an office space, if an office space is part of a multi-tenant floor, I am stuck with my landlord's ability or inability to invest in indoor air quality improvements. And the answer is false, two ways, because there's a win-win. There's an opportunity for sharing in that cost through lease terms, but there's also the opportunity to do standalone indoor air quality improvements for an office suite outside of the base building systems. So don't feel as if you're tied completely to a landlord's ability or inability to invest in that indoor air quality. And so let's get to where the rubber hits the roads and return on investment. And this is where we'll try to tie it all together for you. And again, we've been talking about 20,000 square feet of typical office space. And when we take into consideration a simple return on investment on a workplace with, again, 100 employees and that single air handling unit, take into consideration that you have an average of 4 sick days per year in the United States, and 35% of those sick days are attributed to poor indoor air quality. So that's a day and a half. The average employee salary is $75,000. And then when you take that straight hourly rate of 36 times the day and a half, you get $43,200 a year on an impact of poor indoor air quality. So that's $43,200 a year to the employer. When you look at the indoor air quality improvements, and again, this is a layered effect. It's not a single solution, but we talked about increasing the outside air at $40 an employee, that's $4,000. Increasing that filtration to MERV 13, again, another $1,000. And then UVGI in the air handling unit as that baseline, you're up to $25,000. And then maybe there's another $15,000 for engineering and contingency. So you're at $40,000 of a total initial cost, which is less than a 1-year payback. Again, taking that $43,500 compared to $40,000. It's less than a 1-year payback. And when you start to layer on some of the other technologies, you'd be surprised. It's less than 2-year payback on those technologies. So depending on your portfolio and footprint and your ability based on the facilities that you have and the topology of your systems, there's a myriad of solutions that can be implemented to support the ongoing, not just the response to COVID-19 and returning to the workplace, but ongoing healthy building impacts.
So Greg, the really cool part, I'm going to jump in because I love this little story, right? So these are the hard costs. If you look at, these are things that you're actually buying and installing and maintaining. That cognitive effect study that when you double the outside air, increases your employees' productivity by, let's just say you take the low end of 5,000 and the upper end of 6,000. So you're increasing their productivity by $5,000 to $6,000 per year. That's, times those 100 employees. It makes this almost an instant payback. You can snap your fingers and get the payback. It's really dramatic. So, you look at hard costs and soft costs, and people really need to, as we talk to our clients, they're really starting to see that their employees' time and health and well-being and productivity crushes this number that we're looking at here. This is a great simple analysis that Greg just went through, but I feel like the people that do our jobs every day, whatever it may be, are really the value. That's where you're saving the money, and it's instant, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and so when the next time your client or the C-suite says, we can't afford to do that, you need to share this kind of information because, I say in the back of my mind, how can you not afford to do this? It's just makes all the sense in the world. And so what is the average return on investment? Our last question for improving indoor air quality, it's less than 2 years. And in any facilities decision that I've been party to in my career, if there is less than a 3-year payback, you would do it. The difference here is we're talking about human capital versus energy and real dollars and cents. But when you now have the data to layer on top of that, as Ray was saying, that $6,500 per employee, increased cognitive ability, contribution to the bottom line net revenue, it speaks for itself.
And that's a study we can share with you guys, or anybody that's interested. We'll post that or send that to the group.
So in closing, right, and based on everything we've talked about today, early engagement and proactive engagement by your design professional team is critical in helping to make these sound decisions that enable your corporate real estate teams to align the site selection, lease terms, and any improvements to the building infrastructure that will enable you and your employees to return to healthier buildings and benefit from improvements well beyond this current pandemic and current situation.
So that'll take us to question and answer, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and if we could post the results to the quiz, that might be insightful for some folks, certainly be insightful for me. And some people have clearly seen this presentation before. But that's great. Brian, do we have any questions for
We
Ray?
do. I just want to add before we jump into the questions, I do want to say if this was a graded quiz, I would have not done so great. I just have to throw that out there. But thankfully, this wasn't a graded quiz; it was more a poll. But before we do sign off, yes, there are some questions that came in, and one was actually Greg. You had mentioned the big debate that that was a great presentation, and there were many corporate end users that were willing to pay a higher rental rate, to have better air quality. So I know that you mentioned that that is something that corporate end users are looking for. Have you seen any changes, since COVID started? I mean, yes, that might be that they're willing to pay, but have entities made those changes?
Yeah. So Brian, that's a great question. And the reality is, what we got out of the gate really quickly in our research and education. Over the past 2 months, we've been supporting corporate entities and developers and building operators in about 15 million square feet of space alone just in the past 2 months on improvements, active improvements, whether they be studies or implementations of the technology across the country. So there is a strong movement, and I think that as people start to see that the end of the tunnel is getting further out, but that compounded with the reality that the things that ASHRAE and CDC and engineers are recommending are not just about now, it's about long term, that those investments will serve those facilities for many, many years to come through the useful life of that equipment.
Awesome. So I don't know if Ray or Casey want to add to that, but another question, if you guys want to answer the first one, please jump back to it. But another one I came in, and I know that during this presentation, we talked about some of the indoor air cleaning technology improvements. Which one's the most impactful? If you had to choose one or two.
Yeah, I think that we like to categorize them. It's kind of this layered strategy of, I always say that, you're going to increase ventilation, you're going to increase filtration, but then you start talking about things like active mitigation. And the most prevalent active mitigation strategy is UVGI. It's ultraviolet light applied in the duct or at the air handling unit. And that's one of the biggest things in the market. It's growing. If I'd have known to buy stock in UVC lamp companies, I'd be a millionaire now. But that's really the most prevalent. That's the one that's flying off the shelf. But again, the PCOs and the ionization systems are out there as well. And there's a couple other ones that are spin-offs of PCOs and ionization. But I always think that in that categorization, dilution, filtration, UVGI, and then PCOs and ionization in that order, with the leader being UVGI right now.
And Brian, what's really important is, as Ray said, everybody is pushing these systems. They're not all built the same, designed the same. Some of them do have detrimental impacts to the environment. And so make sure that you're not just relying on the manufacturer's data or information, right? We've actually set up a living lab in one of our clients' underutilized workplaces right now, 30,000 square feet, where we're testing all these technologies and taking indoor air quality readings to make sure that not just the third-party tests, which we're aligned with the companies that we're satisfied with their information, but looking at the real world, how are they really impacting in the workplace? Very important to make sure that you've covered that.
It's good. It's good information. Another one that just popped in. This, Casey, this might be a little bit more related to you, but please, everybody else, jump in. So it starts out: if my facility is LEED certified, I need to consider the other indoor air quality improvements. Meaning, is LEED certified the end all be all? Am I good if my building is LEED certified?
So it can make, Greg and Ray, feel free to jump in. It can depend on the level of LEED certification. There's obviously various levels, and it can depend on the building infrastructure. I mean, back to this presentation and what it hits on. And even though there's indoor air quality improvements that are included as part of LEED, to get the levels we've noted previously, it may be more advantageous to go toward WELL or Fitwel certification in lieu of LEED.
Yeah, and they focus more on healthy building aspects, and LEED was focused predominantly on energy. And I've engaged with my fair share of agitated building operators that I can't sacrifice energy to increase my filtration and increase my outside air. And I'm saying, now's not a time to talk about energy, right? We're talking about the safety and welfare of the people in the building. That takes precedent right now. So how do we make these additional changes? And the technologies that we've looked at, Brian, are not huge energy hogs either. And some of them actually have a payback, like UVGI, on energy, because in addition to the air technology side of it, it's also keeping the coil clean and helping that mechanical unit operate more effectively. So I would say that if your building is LEED certified, don't think that you don't have to do anything. Consult to make sure.
Yeah, the LEED system is very good at certain things, and it actually has some competing values to fight indoor air quality versus energy. And I think the importance is to balance that when you do a LEED certification. I wouldn't throw away LEED. Don't throw away the baby with the bathwater kind of story. It's still an important aspect of how we need to address buildings. They've done a lot for the industry. I think they're just coming up a little short on the healthy building side right now, and there are other better forms of certification that Casey just mentioned.
So another question that came in, and it's along the same lines, and it's actually something that I think our company has actually looked at. I think every tenant has reached out to their landlord. What was my building up to CDC recommendations? We've asked the same question to our offices. We're not experts on that. How do we know? How does the general tenant know that they are in fact up to the CDC recommendations? I mean,
and of course, knowing the right questions to ask, that's where it starts. But then, how do you verify that the information that you're getting back is accurate? Right? We've had landlords tell us, yeah, we're using MERV 13 filters, and when we go out and take a look at them, well, they're not true MERV 13. They're electrostatically charged MERV 8 filters that over time lose their electrostatic charge and then revert back to behaving like MERV 8 filters. And the landlord had no idea, right? They were sold these filters as MERV 13. And so, verifying is really important. And the challenge with verifying is, what's the cost of that? And the cost to having a professional come out and look, not that great. But also, when you think about indoor air quality technology and sensors, there are some newer sensors out on the market that we're testing right now in our living lab that are really inexpensive. We've deployed them in all of our offices across the country, so we can monitor our indoor air quality and monitor humidity, temperature, VOCs, PM 2.5s, and even light and noise. And we get a sense and an understanding of which one of our buildings is operating optimally. And we can also give feedback to our landlord on support in helping him operate his building or her, based on that trending of data that we're capturing every week.
I think that the funny thing that's changed in history, right? So 10, 15 years ago, that would have cost you $20, $30, $40, $50,000 to have an industrial hygienist come bring all of his instruments in there and set them up. It really looked like some kind of mad scientist lab by the time he was gone. And you would have gotten a bunch of reports. And then he'd have taken the equipment away, and you just have one piece of paper that shows a moment in time. Now you can actually have these web-enabled sensors in your space, and you can trend it. That's the important thing. To Greg's point, when you come in the morning and you feel a little drowsy or you stay late, you want to know if they left the air handling unit on. Was the outside air damper open? This little monitor that sits on a desk can tell you those things and trend it. Really helpful in your ability to understand how well your space is functioning and how your landlord's treating their tenant. Not to say I'm on one side of that fence or the other, but we need to do what's right for the humans that occupy buildings.
Brian, the funny thing is our building in Rockville, Maryland was always susceptible when they had thunderstorms to power outages. And every time that I would come into the office after a power outage, the chiller would never be on. The office space, in a 10th floor, top floor would be, in the 80s, and I'd be miserable. Well, now I go on my mobile app, I call up my air sensor, and I can see what the temperature is before I trek all the way into the office. So I love it.
Certainly. Well, and an additional question that popped up. And this is actually, I think that this will be a very general question that applies to a lot of people, especially as we're seeing, tenants renewing, right? And maybe their leases are coming up in the next 12, 24, 36 months. They might, how do they get their landlord to make some changes that they need, right? I mean, there are some companies that have come back to the office. There are some that maybe are waiting till September, till January, what have you, but how are they able to negotiate if their lease is coming up a little bit sooner than maybe somebody who's committed for the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. And I think the reality is that, while some of these installs and technologies are relatively reasonable, those of us with larger portfolios, it's a big dollar. It adds up quickly. And so as you look at, if you have a lease coming up sometime within the next 30 months, there's nothing stopping you from negotiating with a landlord an early lease renewal or extension and taking advantage of that cost sharing of those improvements and working it into your lease. We heard it in the big debate, right? Corporate real estate professionals said, we're willing to pay more than a cost per square foot for a healthier building. So make it happen now. Utilize their resources in getting the additional funding from investors to extend that lease and pay for it over a longer term. So instead of renewing in 2 years for another 5-year lease, look at a 7 or 8 year lease and start it now and start to pay that off and support together making those improvements.
Great response. Great question from the audience. And last question, so we can end here on time. So this actually relates to one of the original questions that was asked. But I guess this just happened recently, and I don't have the verification of when this was, but I'm going to take this question as true from the audience. The state of Virginia has issued an emergency temporary standard on infectious disease prevention for tenants and landlords. So how do I know that my landlord is complying with these requirements? So I think, looking at the audience, many tenants might be in Virginia, Maryland, DC. If Virginia is doing something, a lot of them talk. So this might be a question that relates to the Mid-Atlantic more so. But obviously, right now, Virginia has this.
Yeah, we're operating across the country, and Virginia is the first state that we've seen this language.
Okay.
There's mandates in other jurisdictions, but not as comprehensive as what the state of Virginia has put out. And to be honest with you, Brian, most landlords aren't aware of it. It's been brought to our attention twice with 2 different tenants for building occupants. And it's fairly comprehensive and does require some due diligence on the tenant's part to determine and understand what category they fall in, whether it's high risk, moderate risk, or low risk in regards to their workplace and what they're doing in that workplace. And so the requirements based on that vary. And again, it kind of comes back to verify. The requirements are not overreaching or difficult to comply with, but I think it's knowledge and understanding about what the requirement is, and then making sure that we verified that we're addressing it, whether it's on the landlord side or whether it's on the tenant side. There's responsibility on both. And so it comes back to that verification.
Sure. So that was the final question. Any last words before I close it out?
Well, I would just say, first of all, thank you for having WB and Gensler this morning. It's a great way to start a Wednesday, and we look forward to seeing everybody sometime in the future, actual face-to-face. But we're here, the architectural and engineering community is here to support corporate real estate as you work through the challenges of returning back to work. But more importantly, as you look forward at healthy buildings overall, and making certain that the spaces that you're leasing or the spaces that you're building out are designed beyond bare minimums, and recognizing that your professionals can give you the necessary information that you need for the C-suite and CFOs to align with the potential additional costs associated with healthy buildings. And I think once people start to understand more the return on investment, that these will become new standards going forward.
So I'd like to say thank you as well, and also just say that a lot of times you walk away from these presentations with some questions after you leave and you close your Zoom meeting. So feel free to reach out to us, call us, email us, any of us. I'll speak for Casey and Greg and offer their support post-meeting. But I just find that there's a lot of information in these presentations. So follow-up questions are often pop into people's heads. So please send them on. We're happy to help you through these things.
Just echoing Ray and Greg, thanks for having us, and look forward to seeing and hearing from everybody very soon.
Perfect. Well, Casey, Ray, Greg, thank you guys for joining this morning. And obviously that was a very interesting and dynamic conversation. Love the questions from the audience. I think those were a great addition. And obviously everybody, thank you for attending this morning's event, and please continue to look on our events calendar. We have some great events coming up, and we look forward to having everybody join and come back. Hopefully soon we will be able to get in person, but until then, enjoy the rest of your day, and talk soon.
Thank you, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Brian.